Now, the only other person I know about that can talk about sex that much in public, death and money, is Miss Hannah Sale. Please tell me welcome to the stage, Hannah Sale.
Hello. It's hard to follow the slow jam right in the morning. Get us going. Let me make sure I got this plugged in just right. All right. Yeah. My name is Anna Sale. I am the host and managing editor of Death, Sex, and Money, a podcast from WNYC Studios. I am so honored to be here. Congratulations to Dan and the whole podcast movement team. Thank you for inviting me. I'm so glad to share the stage with my colleague from WNYC Studios, Glenn, and of course, Kevin Smith. How cool is that? My show is about life transitions. It's about the hard things that we all go through, but don't always know how to talk about: death, sex, and money. So there's bold questions, and it's also about why I need to know these things. So what I'm going through is woven in to the episodes as we've created them. So as I talk about podcasting today, I want to start with where I am right now in my life, what's been going on with me. This is me about 8 weeks ago, right before maternity leave started. You can see that I'm thrilled to be working that late in my pregnancy. So I want to talk today about how hosting a podcast is like having a baby, because there are many ways that is true. There are 10 ways that I'm going to go over. There are more I'm sure you can come up with. I'm also going to tell you a little bit about my backstory, how I came to create Death, Sex, and Money. I'll play a little tape, and hopefully we'll have a little time for questions at the end. But number one, how hosting a podcast is like having a baby, is it starts with this inexplicable urge. For ladies, you know where it starts. And you can't explain it because, number one, it costs a lot of money, it's irrational, you don't know how to do it, overpopulation. I mean, have you seen the iTunes charts? That thing is not stable. Podcasting is overpopulated. And there's also this sense that maybe you're missing this moment. Podcasting is huge right now. And so just like having a baby for women, you get this sense, if you have this idea you want it to happen, all these questions of like, how am I going to do it? When am I going to do it? What am I in control of? You don't know the answers to that, but you know maybe if you have that feeling that it's something you want to do. When I started feeling that about podcasting, I was covering politics. This is me about 4 years ago, almost exactly 4 years ago, at the Democratic National Convention. I was covering politics. I spent the whole summer going to swing states and talking to voters and asking them about how they felt. So I was hearing these incredibly compelling stories about identity and wondering if people fit in this moment in America in 2012 at the time. A lot of stories about economic anxiety, a lot of stories about, I used to vote this way, but then I got divorced, and now I have to pay for my kid to go to college, so I'm voting this way. They were really captivating stories. And I connected with the voters when I was doing these interviews. It really fed me. But then the stories I was producing didn't have that same quality, because the tape I was collecting was one little soundbite that was going to be in a story about who was up in the polls or whose advertising strategy was working. It didn't, for listeners, I don't think, have that same element of really getting to know someone. And I really felt that sense of polarization and separation and alienation in this country, this kind of urge to just feel heard, to feel connected. And I wasn't feeling like I was able to do that in my work. And that's important to me because of where I come from, this sense of kind of feeling like you're part of a community. This is my hometown of Charleston, West Virginia. And it's a small city in West Virginia. And one of the things that I loved about growing up there is it's a relatively politically conservative place. This is, the kind of capital of coal country. But I grew up in the city working at a bookstore art gallery and where all the art students worked. It was like a cool scene. And so some of our, customers had piercings all over the place. And then a lot of our customers were just older folks who had lived in West Virginia for generations. And I really liked that mix. I liked having all of that in my life and that conversation that resulted as a result of those encounters. And as I was covering politics, I realized, I was having these exchanges with voters, but what was really happening was I was just a voyeur who was dropping into these communities. And what my life was really made up of was my colleagues in New York media, 30-somethings who live near me in Brooklyn, and my very carefully curated Twitter feed. And it didn't really feel satisfying. And then after 2012 was 2013, and I covered the mayor's race in New York City, where among my jobs was covering Anthony Weiner's second Twitter scandal. So that also was not emotionally gratifying for me, although it was really about sex. It kind of helped me figure out the questions I needed to ask about sex in my show. But during that 2013 race, I did do an interview that showed me what I could do with that urge to create a podcast. This was an interview I did with then candidate Bill de Blasio, now mayor of New York City. And we talked about his family in this interview and his father's alcoholism, which really consumed his father just as Bill de Blasio was becoming a teenager. And when he was 18, when Bill de Blasio was 18, his father killed himself. I'm going to play a little bit of tape. You were 18 years old that summer?
I had just turned 18, yeah.
How did you find out?
I don't remember the exact, moment of phone call. I remember my mom telling me that we had to, go to Connecticut really suddenly. But my memory is that the police called her. And, we went down there. I remember very vividly, not going in to identify the body. I just didn't feel up to that. My brother Stephen volunteered to do it. My mother certainly didn't feel up to it. I think in one way or another we all thought we would be saying goodbye in some more traditional way, and suddenly he was gone, but he was gone in such difficult circumstances over the course of years and years. It was just very, very hard to figure out. It's still hard to figure out to this day.
So that was an interview about Bill de Blasio's family, and some may say, what does this have to do with the kinds of policies he would bring to City Hall if he became mayor? To me, this interview was really illuminating. Bill de Blasio was not born Bill de Blasio. He had his father's last name. He subsequently changed it to de Blasio, which comes from his mother's family. And I thought that was really revealing about his character and about how he thought about the world, that he had this idea that you could make a break from something that was painful or not working and totally remake your future. And that informs a lot of, I think, his political view. So I really liked doing that interview. I thought it was important, and it showed me that this is what I wanted to do more of. But then comes the second way that podcasting is like having a baby. Many factors have to align, many of which you're not personally in control of. So maybe you have this idea, I'm going to have a baby. Who am I going to have a baby with? If I'm not going to have a baby with someone, how am I going to do that? So all of these questions come up. Do I have time? Do I know how to do this? For me, the factors that aligned in terms of starting a podcast was this email that popped into my inbox from one of the bosses at WNYC where I was working. Again, I was just a reporter in the newsroom at this time, and this email shows up that says, hey, we want new show ideas. If you work in this building, we want to hear from you. We're having a contest. Give us your idea. We're going to let the finalists pilot their idea. So basically, this was this invitation from the universe to finally spend some time, get clear on if I were really going to make a podcast, this urge that I had, what would it be? And that's how I came up with Death, Sex, and Money. And you can see it might be a little small for those of you in the back. The first question was really important that they asked, that the bosses at WNYC asked. They just said in fewer than 300 words, what's the elevator pitch for this show? What's it about? Why do we care? Why will it be successful? And so this made me really spend time and think about what was it that I really wanted to do? Why was this missing in the podcasting landscape? How would it be successful? who would host it? Me. I just put myself forward. And I said, I kind of, given my experience in 2012 and 2013, I had this sense that like there was this hunger for this kind of show. I said, I think it'll hit a chord because these are questions we care most about, dealing with death, sex, and money, and a lot of places where we need community in navigating modern adulthood. So that was the idea. I sent it off to the bosses. And then positive. It's happening. I get to pilot my podcast. Dream come true. And it's terrifying because when you learn all of a sudden that this thing that you sort of wished you could do and, in the back of your mind, it's happening, but it takes a while before it's actually happening. So here I was pregnant, and when you're pregnant, you are growing this thing. You sort of have an idea of what the inputs are, but you don't know how they're all fitting together. You're not sure, quite seriously, you're not sure if it's viable. There's a lot of worry. There's a lot of wondering, is this actually what I wanted? I hope this is what I wanted because now it's actually happening. And again, it's hard work. And it can feel a little isolating when you're in that phase of gestating this idea, this piloting phase. It's isolating because you don't know what you're doing. No one else can cut the tape or book the interview for you if it's coming from you, but you're experimenting. You're trying to figure it out. You're trying to see what works. You're playing things for people. And it's scary because you're putting yourself out there. You're saying, I want to do this. I'm doing this now. But you don't know if it's going to work. And in my case, my show about life transitions and about dealing with hard things and confronting hard things, I'm making this as my personal life was not on solid ground.
Ms. Anna Sales, this is Alan K. Simpson in the wilds of Wyoming, former U.S. Senator.
This is a message I got on my cell phone.
Need to talk to you about an urgent matter. Nothing life-threatening at all, I can assure you.
Okay, so that message came on my cell phone. Alan K. Simpson from the wilds of Wyoming is a former U.S. Senator, and he was calling to talk about my love life. Because at the time, I was in a relationship, and then I was not in a relationship. My boyfriend and I had broken up. We were long distance, and we decided together it wasn't going to work. My boyfriend at the time was spending a lot of time in Wyoming. I lived in New York City. How is this going to work? And then Arthur changed his mind, and there was this ball, really a ball, this is a true story, that I was going to be his date to in Wyoming. And I told him, I'm not coming to this ball. We've made the decision to not be together. It's not happening. Let's move on. And he had one more thing to try, which was to get Alan K. Simpson, the former U.S. Senator, to call me and make sure, just say, come to the ball. No commitment, just come. It'll be fun. We'll dance. So I did go to the ball, and I became friends with Alan K. Simpson and his lovely wife, Anne, who've been married now more than 60 years. And I ended up making a radio story about it, one of the first episodes of Death, Sex, and Money. And I want to play you the piece of tape that was the hardest for me to write.
Then the ball ended, and I had a plane to catch the next morning, and I didn't know what to tell Arthur about what would happen next. Because it wasn't just the distance that had made it hard for us. I was also really scared of committing to a relationship that wasn't going to work. I'm divorced. I'm in my 30s, and I want to be a mother. And I was so afraid of making the wrong choice again and losing time. Anne says that night at the ball, she could tell.
I saw there were some wounds there.
What'd you see?
Well, it was a little touchy. You were a little standoffish. And thought, well, either it'll work or it won't. But at least you were willing to give it a try.
Yeah.
If it cratered, I wouldn't lose a bit of sleep. Not a bit. Not really, I mean that, because you've done what you can do.
So that's Alan and Ann Simpson talking with me. And what was so hard about that and uncomfortable was here my background was being an authority, being a reporter, covering politics, asking the tough questions. And in this setting, hosting my podcast, I was going to say, I want to be a mother. I don't know who I'm going to have a kid with. I'm scared. I'm divorced. I don't know what's happening in my life. And I have to ask these people that I've just met for help on something really, really essential. And that didn't feel automatic. That was something I had to sort of push myself to do. But I think it was really key in establishing the sort of feel of the show of Death, Sex, and Money. It's a place where those vulnerable moments actually you find when you share, there's resonance. That's what we hear from listeners. Another thing I thought a lot about during piloting was moving from radio to podcasting. I was like, oh my gosh, it's been automatic that people would hear my stories. If they're driving in their car, if they're making dinner and have the radio on, my work gets heard. Podcasting, you have to make the argument for someone to go find your show, press play, and spend their time listening to you. And I didn't know how to do that. In pregnancy, the way I made things grow, true story, baby was a little underweight, then I had an ice cream diet time, baby got better. The way you make podcasts grow, there are lots of different ways. This is one surefire way, Ira. And this is actually really key. I didn't understand quite what was happening. I knew it would be a good thing if one of the early episodes of Death, Sex, and Money showed up on This American Life. I knew that would be a huge life achievement, and it would be really a good way to come out of the gate. So we pitched this episode with Alan Simpson and Ann Simpson and me to This American Life. They took it. And so we ended up scheduling our launch of our podcast for when the episode was going to run on This American Life. But what we found, it was really interesting. This American Life comes out on the radio over the weekends, and then the podcast comes out. And you could see, people hear about my show. Ira says, go find it. It's for free on iTunes. I'm crying in my living room hearing Ira Glass talk about my new show on the radio. But when we really saw the growth in the podcast was when the podcast of This American Life came out. So again, getting mentioned on other podcasts is really key to growth because it makes sense. If you're mentioned on the radio or if you're in a magazine article, it doesn't mean someone's necessarily holding their phone and going to immediately go and hit subscribe. But when they're listening to one of their podcasts that they love, they hear the mention of your show, they're much more likely to go, I'm going to go check that out, subscribe, and then you see your numbers go up. And we've worked with This American Life, it's been such an honor. Also worked with Reply All, worked with Dan Savage, worked with Sampler, worked with The Big Listen, and that's what we've seen. That's when the little spikes in our audience have gone up, when we're mentioned on other podcasts. So that's what I was thinking about as I'm piloting. What is this? How is it going to find an audience? And then all of a sudden, it's here. The moment, my dream has come true. I have a podcast. It is out there in the world. I did it. And then I find out my new baby is a bottomless pit of need. Seriously. So that is how the sixth way that having a podcast is like having a baby. You have to ask for help. In the case of having my baby, Jasmine, our first labor and delivery nurse, she offered us amazing help. She taught my husband Arthur, how to change a diaper, how to bathe the baby. She taught me how to nurse. She just was there with us, showing us the most basics of parenting on her 12-hour shift. It was amazing. Thank you, labor and delivery nurses. Death, Sex, and Money. This is just part of the team that helps me. This top picture are folks that we worked with last summer. That's Emily Botine, my editor, Benjamin Franklin, and Rachel Aronoff, who is in the room somewhere, our interns last summer. There's me and Katie Bishop, a producer on the show. Been holding our great tote bags. It's me and Katie Bishop and Chester Jesus Soria, who joined the team late last year. And this is what has been really essential to getting the show out and to growing it, is to have other people to bounce story ideas off of, to do booking, to do editing, to do social media, to do the really important work of engaging with listeners who write in, to do live events. And of course, there's all the other work of promotions and artwork, like our logo, that we rely on the WNYC team, the WNYC Studios team, to help us with. And we also have really relied on listeners in a way that I didn't expect. So that's the 7th way that hosting a podcast is like having a baby. You have to pay attention to feedback. This is my father with Arthur and our new baby. This is him showing just how to hold the baby when it's swaddled, just so. I love this picture. And the feedback thing is kind of an interesting thing, because we all know when you're hosting a podcast, you're putting your life's work, you're putting the thing that you care the most about out onto the internet, which can be a dangerous place. It can be a mean place. It can be particularly difficult for women. And that's what you have to do. You got to put yourself out there. So that's why those 300 words when I was pitching the show were really important to start, was because it grounded me in, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to achieve. But as feedback started to come in from listeners, there was some really important stuff, along with the kind of internet comments that you want to ignore and never think about and not let them get in the back of your head late at night. But the important things from listeners are the things that they see that you don't see, that you didn't know that you were doing, the things they hear that you didn't hear when you were putting the episode together. And it really showed us in the team at Death, Sex, and Money that we're not making this show alone, that the listeners who are responding really have things that they want to share, have things that they want to hear about. Immediately after those first episodes of the show aired, including the episode with Al Simpson and Ann Simpson, people just wrote in sharing, here's what happened in my long-distance relationship. Here's a tip for making a long-distance relationship work. Other people just wrote in saying, I am in my mid-30s and I'm feeling that same kind of absolute existential dread. Thank you for sharing that. And it was really cool to see, oh, this is like a community that we can continue to grow. And so that's become a key part of some of the episodes that we make, is just asking listeners the most open-ended questions about death, sex, and money, and asking them to share their stories. We've done episodes about cheating and infidelity. We've done episodes about how you handle money and relationships. We've done episodes about near-death experiences. We asked people to tell us why they're not having sex right now. And people wrote in, told us stories, recorded voice memos, and we put these episodes together. The one that I really liked, because I didn't know what we were going to get, was one just about siblings. We asked listeners to tell stories about how their sibling relationships had changed as they had become adults. And we got some really intense stories.
This is what I heard in the more than 200 stories you sent in about your siblings.
We had what I considered the best relationship a sibling could have.
Fast forward to the present, my siblings and I are barely speaking.
For whatever reason, I find it harder and harder to get them to say anything towards me.
He would tell a stranger to check out more than he would tell me.
And I'm not really sure
why he suddenly looked at me with such disdain.
It's a tough thing because, man, we were so close.
I know Dad wants us to have a relationship.
But, she's turned her back on us.
That's where we are now. We're severed. Well, almost.
The thing I love about these listener episodes is you get to hear who is the Death, Sex, and Money community. You hear old voices, younger voices. You hear people with different accents. You hear Americans. You hear people who are in Australia and parts of Europe. And so you're reflecting the audience back to itself. And then that in itself grows the engagement, because people feel like you're listening back when you're making the podcast, that it matters that they interact with you. And the stories are really incredible. They're better stories than we could dream up alone sitting in an edit room at WNYC. These are stories that our listeners are sending to us and then we stitch together. And these listener episodes, where it's a collage of different stories, they have routinely been some of our most popular episodes. We interview celebrities, we interview people with big names, but these stories where the listeners are able to hear themselves in conversation with other listeners, that's really, really what draws the crowd. And so this gets to the best part about having a baby and hosting a podcast for me. Because as it grows, you clarify and focus on the values that you want to amplify out in the world. You have to think really hard about what it is you are doing by growing this thing. And it's enormously gratifying. It's an enormous sense of purpose. I want a little asterisk. You don't have to have a kid. You don't have to host a podcast to feel that sense of purpose. But for me, It's been so cool to get to see my style reflected back at me. This is Baby, 4th of July, in her cowboy hat. And also the values in the show, and which also happen to be the values that I want to teach as a parent, which are empathy, curiosity, humility, honesty. It's really important, honest, like going right at those hard truths, all of which are really what make up listening, what make up that sense of connection. I want to tell you about an episode that we had trouble with when it gets to honesty just in the last few months. We did an episode, we thought it was going to be about heroin addiction and recovery. So we found this couple who had been addicted beginning as teenagers. They had been together for a number of years. They'd gotten married. They'd had kids as they were using on and off. And then they'd finally gotten clean. And so I wanted to know, how does that work? How does that work that you're able to go through all of that together? And how do you recover from having kids? And what's the relationship with your family now that you're clean and they know that drug addiction was a part of your history? So we did the interview. I thought it was going to be a great episode. And then, because honesty in journalism is one of the key values of Death, Sex, and Money, we did some fact-checking, and we found out that the husband in the relationship currently had child sex abuse charges pending against him. This had not been anything, what we thought the episode was going to be about. So then we said, well, do we just scrap the episode? We thought this was going to be an episode about heroin addiction. What do we do? And we decided, you know what, this is what's real and what's happening in this family's life. They didn't tell us. They seemed to be in a bit of denial that this was happening. So I called them back. I asked about the charges, talked to both the husband and the wife. The husband denied them. The wife said she wasn't really sure. And that's where we ended the episode, that it was unresolved. And a few months later, he pled guilty to one of the charges against him. She left him, has the kids. And so I interviewed her about what was going on in her life. And this is one of the questions.
Are you at all afraid that you'll be enticed to use again?
Actually, I never ever thought about using until a month ago. That was the very first time, and there was an evening. I actually went online and I looked around trying to figure out what neighborhood I'd have to go to, but at the end, I decided that I was just being self-destructive and that it was pointless. And I would end up hurting more than just myself. And I think that's who I wanted to hurt. But my self-destruction would have ripples across my entire family.
So that's a woman we called Suzanne. We did change the couple's name in part to protect the identity of the victim in the child sex abuse charges. But we did this interview with Suzanne. I talked to Suzanne, and again, it was ending in this very unresolved place. She had just left this relationship that she'd been in for years. She didn't know how she was going to support her kids. She was getting used to sleeping in a bed by herself. And she was also feeling this enormous shame for not leaving the relationship sooner, for not seeing that her partner was capable of something like this. And so that's where we left that interview. But I said, I imagine some listeners in our audience have maybe gone through similar things. So if you have a note you want to send to Suzanne, send it to us. And we got this incredible outpouring of encouragement, of swapping stories, people who had been in abusive relationships, people who had been abused and talked about their relationship with their mother, people who just wanted to say, here are some resources I really hope you check out. And then some were just lovely notes like this one, just telling you this is a dark moment and you're going to get through it. And so we were able to pass that on to Suzanne, and it's been really wonderful. It's not solving what's going on in her life, but again, she feels that sense of connection. She feels maybe a little less alone. The ninth way that podcasting, hosting a podcast and having a baby are alike is it can be also really fun. It's not all these dark things. And one really cool thing that we did in the last year was, again, I was having a baby. I was also moving cross country. I was undergoing all this big life change. And so we asked our listeners to send us the songs that they have blasted on their stereos when they're in moments of big transition. And we created a Spotify playlist. We called it our Anthems of Change playlist. And it was everything from Janelle Monáe to Journey to, everything. Just the songs that get you pumped and make you feel like you can overcome anything. And the playlist was so good. Then we said, I wonder if people will send us dance videos of themselves engaging with their anthem of change. And they did.
Hi, Anna. I'm going through some transitions.
I have a lot of uncertainty in my life.
Big changes. And part of what got me through was music.
We got married a year and a half ago, and now we're getting a divorce. I like Mary Lambert's song, Secrets, so damn much because growing up in the South, we were always taught not to air out your dirty laundry.
Dysfunctional, but we have a good time killing.
My sister and I used to have dance parties all the time growing up, and we've actually started doing them again since I've lived here, and life has been so upside down.
Well, I'm over it.
In the summer of 2013, that was probably the first time in my life that I was physically just debilitated by depression. I struggled to get out of bed every single day. So that summer, when I would go to work in the morning, that'd be the first song on my list was Good Ass Intro. It's a very optimistic song. It gave me, these sort of mantras.
I just kept on playing it because it just kept on saying, don't give up, don't give up.
I see the song as representative of a big change in my life.
I owe him in that song a lot. I really do.
My husband was incarcerated a few years ago, and I was left with a 3-year-old. And I lived in his mother's basement with my daughter, and every weekend we would travel to my mother's house to get away. We would sing this song back and forth for about a year.
I'm taking my freedom, putting it in my car. Wherever I choose to go, it won't take me far. I'm living my life like it's golden, living my life like it's golden.
My name is David. Being a gay man and being an undocumented immigrant for a big part of my life, I very much felt like I was always painting a portrait of what I wanted people in my life to think my life was. And it was so exhausting having to keep up lies. So the song really just speaks to me about how, I'm done with that.
In times of struggle,
attempting to leave my cushy government job,
death, and my dad getting sick,
relationship drama,
the very first love of my life,
slipped in the fact that he would want an open relationship during brunch.
Bam, things do change.
I'm so glad that I found that song.
It just changed my whole outlook. And shut up that little voice that says I can't do it.
I'm not sure where I'll end up, but I'm hopeful and I'm enjoying the ride.
It was such an agent of change for me.
And that song can still make me cry, make me feel brave, and fill my heart with hope.
I love that. I love that. I love that we said, video yourselves dancing to the song that's been really important to you, and people did. And they sent it to us. And that gets to the 10th way that having a baby is like hosting a podcast. It grows and it changes, and you just go with it. It's cool to see what you can do as you build your audience, as you build that sense of community. I never thought when I was pitching the show and those 300 words that 2.5 years later, people would be sending dance videos to me. I thought I was just going to be hosting an interview show. And then all of a sudden, we have this really cool other way that we're connecting. And that's what I think is so cool and specific about podcasting versus radio or other ways of engaging with an audience. You're really forging a relationship with your listeners, and they're going to stick with you as the show grows and changes because you have that bond together. If you as a host listen to your listeners, they hear themselves in the show, and it feels like it's a place that's really alive and vital and changing. And here's another way that a relationship has continued as the show has been out in the world. That's Alan Ann Simpson just a few weeks ago, meeting the baby for the first time. I love that picture. So I have just a few minutes left, about 5 minutes. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand about growing a podcast, starting a podcast, building community. I saw your hand go up first. Yeah, I think there are microphones, is that right?
I'll use my big one.
Okay, and I'll repeat what you say.
So you talked about how important feedback is. So any tips about how to get feedback?
Oh, how to get feedback. Tips on getting feedback. Well, there's two kinds of feedback I think that are really essential. First, when you're beginning to make your show, before maybe you've put it out into the world, it's really important to swallow your pride and play messy drafts for people, because everybody needs an editor. It's going to make the show sharper. It's going to help you clarify what you're trying to do. Someone says, why is that in there? And if you feel yourself get really protective and defensive about it, you know that that's something that's a really core part of what you're trying to do. That's what we did at WNYC when I was piloting. There were times when I was alone with a Pro Tools session and feeling really freaked out, but then there were also really incredible moments when I was like walking down the hall past an audio engineer at WNYC, and I was like, I don't know how to score, but I know I want a theme music that's like, you know, like a soulful gospel road trip song. And he's like, I know what you need. And he came over, he ended up being the composer of our theme song. The second part of feedback that I think is really key is, again, paying attention to what your listeners are saying back to you. You know, one of the things that's been really good and instructive for me is, Anna, your show's called Death, Sex, and Money. Like, ask the tough, damn questions. And it's made me more bold as an interviewer, and to notice where are the places where I feel uncomfortable as an interviewer and pushing me. But again, sifting through that feedback is really important. If there's something that's like, I hate the sound of your voice, your show is boring, I'm never listening again, let that one go. You know? You right there?
Yeah, I have a question about the tough questions that you ask. A lot of sensitive personal questions there.
I think there's a microphone, yep.
A question about your tough questions. A lot of personal, this interview is over questions. When do you decide to ask those? Do you kind of have the order of your questions pre-planned? Do you throw them out based on how the conversation is going? Have you ever had an experience where someone refused to answer a question? Okay, yes. I think that the order of the questions is really important when you're pre-gaming and thinking about, okay, because basically when you're doing research and getting ready for an interview, you're thinking like, what is the relationship arc going to be for this hour or 2 hours that I have with this person? I want to make them feel safe. I want to make them feel like I'm not an idiot, so they will share with me. But the biggest thing that I think is helpful in Death, Sex, and Money interviews is at the very top, I say, the show is called Death, Sex, and Money. So I'm going to ask you questions about that. But the reason I ask questions about that is not to be gratuitous or to feel exploitive. It's because the show is about the things that we all go through. So in that way, it's like setting up the person to think like, do I want to play along? Do I want to say, oh, well, this is the difficult death that I had to get through? And then I also say, if there's something you don't want to talk about that I ask, just say. And so I think that creating those ground rules, I think, sets up the expectations for the interview. But then there's often times when you're doing the interview and then something comes up that I didn't expect. You know, someone talks about vaginal dryness as they've aged, as Lucinda Williams did. God bless her. And I was like, okay, I'm going to ask a follow-up question about this and see like how much she wants to talk about it. And so that's where you're sort of in the moment and gauging how much you can push. But I think when you know you have that zinger question that's going to be something that is tender, it's all about kind of placing it. You don't want to do it very last, because that's wimpy, you know, because you want to give time to like explore it if they want to talk about it. But, you know, you sort of establish, where they were in their life. What I like to do is have a timeline of someone's life. And so I can say, so when you were 35, your career was you were washed up. Like, what was going on?
how did you know that it was the right move to move back to Texas from Nashville? As I asked Robert Earl Keen, I think he was 30, not 35. But you're sort of allowing them to retell the story, and you don't ask it in a way that's, God, so you're a total failure when you were 30, you know. So it's that mix of like planning, but then being really attuned to what's happening in the moment of the interview. You in the pink jacket?
First of all, I want to say I'm a huge fan.
Thank you.
And I've asked this question before, but I feel like you might be the right person to answer it. And pardon me if this is like a bad analogy or anything, but if WNYC, you have a lot of support from WNYC, so if that's like having a partner in the relationship, what advice do you have for the podcasters who are single mothers, so to speak?
Yes. I'm so glad you asked this.
Which I am.
Yeah.
By the way.
Awesome.
We've got a booth 46. Come visit me.
Cool. What's your name and what's your podcast?
Sherry Barclay. And I have a tool where you can put your podcast over the phone, but I also have a podcast called The Piss Cast.
Yes.
Which comes from my independent studio in Bushwick, Brooklyn, out of a storage container called kpiss.fm.
Awesome. Okay. I'm really glad you asked this question because I had this whole extended metaphor about different ways you can give birth, and you are a home birth example. And there were really great graphics to go with it, but then I thought that might get us derailed. So I am like the going into the hospital with all the experts and all kinds of support with really good health insurance, like that. I'm that model of giving birth. And, you know, it's a lot harder to do the home birth thing. It takes a lot more guts. It's a lot riskier also. So I think the advice that I would give is, I have never been an independent producer. I've always worked in public radio stations, so keep that in mind. But the advice that I would give is really cultivate a community to be with you on the journey. You need people to listen to your tape. You need people to swap tips on how to get advertisers. Hillary Frank from The Longest Shortest Time tells really great stories when she was starting as an independent producer of just calling up people who she thought might want to reach listeners to a podcast about early childhood and early parenthood, and sure enough, she got advertisers. So you want to cultivate a community of people who can share those kinds of stories. And then the other thing I would do is, even if you're independent, it's be mindful of partnerships. And that's what's really awesome about the community that we're all a part of in podcasting, is it's still a nice place to work, you know, because we're young enough that we're all growing, that more and more people are discovering podcasts, so everybody has an interest in helping each other out and getting the word out. So I would still really be aggressive about looking for collaborations and different ways to partner. I'm going to take one more question from somebody not in this right in front of me. You right there with your hand up?
Congratulations on the baby and the podcast.
Thank you very much.
You do a great job involving the listeners, and I wonder if you could share some of the things that you think about when you craft a call out, or maybe an example of one that totally fell flat and you try to avoid.
Yeah. That's a really good question. So his question was, how do you craft a listener call out to get good stories, to get stuff that can make an episode? I should say, first of all, like even the listener episodes that we put together and that we're really proud of, there's a lot of editing. So there's many, many stories that come in, and we thank people for sharing, and we'll include little bits and montages. But we really try to focus on like this 5 or 6 or 7 stories that we found ourselves going home and telling our partners about, or telling, you know, our colleagues about. Oh my God, listen to this voice memo. So in it, no matter what, you're doing a lot of editing and a lot of throwing out. But I think the key, it's always an experiment. We did one call out for tell us a story about money and death. And we got a lot of stories back about so-and-so died without a will, and then I had to spend all this time going through my father's papers, and here's what this was like. And then we got a lot of stories like that. And it just didn't feel like there was an arc there for a whole episode, so we didn't make that episode. But what we did do was we included some of those stories in other places in the show. In our mid-show break, we do a lot of kind of feedback where we play what listeners are saying to us. The one about why you're not having sex right now, that was just Katie Bishop, one of the producers on the show, one of the lead producers. She's just said, let's just ask and see what people say. And people wanted to talk about it. And so that was like, just ask. And then the key, I think, to getting lots of good responses is to immediately, as things start coming in, like making sure you play back some of them for the listeners so that they know that other people are sharing. And then that, I think, primes people to be more willing to share. You want to ask open-ended questions. And what I think in the sibling episode and the cheating episode, you want stories that are both like, this was really, really hard and terrible and like, ugh, you're going somewhere really vulnerable. And then you also want to have something that allows for lighter stories because you want that mix for the listener. So those are kind of the big things we think about. And just ask a broad question and see what happens. That is, I think, all the time I have. I want to just point out, this is my favorite picture from Parenthood so far. Speaking about what you can't control, my daughter loves to have her hands up by her face, and so she doesn't like to be swaddled. And this is what she did one night after we swaddled her. Flipping the bird to her parents, a few weeks old. I'm on Twitter at Anna Sale. The show is at Death, Sex, Money, and please check us out at deathsexmoney.org. Thank you again for having me.
In 2017, podcast movement is hitting the road as we make our way to the West Coast. Spend some of your summer with us at the beautiful Anaheim Marriott in Anaheim, California. Join us August 23rd through the 25th as podcast movement does it better than ever. We'll once again have amazing featured speakers and all of your best podcaster friends from all around the world. All that's missing is you. Register today, and we'll see you in California.
Like the rhythm in the street, my body grooving from my head to my feet. Just feel the beat.